A lot of people in my workshops would ask me about story structure, and originally the workshops were more about what we called the hidden tools of comedy. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that there was a very particular kind of story structure in comedy. My friend Chris Vogler wrote this great book, The Writer's Journey, and the writer's journey is a takeoff on the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And if you've seen Star Wars, you've seen a good example of the hero's journey, the young protagonist who has greatness within them, and then there's a call to action, and then there's the refusal of the call, they meet the mentor, and on and on. And in thinking about it, I thought that there are a lot of structures, similar structures to comedy, but there are also very important differences as well. And so I started working on this book called The Comic Hero's Journey. And in The Comic Hero's Journey, it starts sort of like the hero's journey in the normal world. We see the protagonist, whether it's Bill Murray in Groundhog Day or Melissa McCarthy in Spy, we see them in their normal world. But the big difference, one of the big differences in The Comic Hero's Journey is that whereas in the hero's journey, the protagonist has greatness within them, only they don't know it. In the comic hero's journey, usually the protagonist does not have greatness within them. In fact, the protagonist is really messed up. In Spy, Melissa McCarthy is self-doubting. She's very beholden to what other people think of her. She really wants the attention of her spy, Bradley Fine, played by Jude Law. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray's a jerk, and he's just an out-and-out creep who doesn't like other people and doesn't care that other people don't like him. So in the comic hero's journey, you start with a character who is in some way broken or flawed, or they have a hole in them, but they don't know it. They're happy to be in their world. They think that whatever is happening in their world is the way it's supposed to be. And so they have initial goals. And in the comic hero's journey, the initial goal is always something short-sighted and soon to change. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray simply wants to get a job at a bigger television station. Right now he's a newscaster, weathercaster in Pittsburgh, and he wants to go to a bigger television station. In Spy, Melissa McCarthy simply wants this gorgeous James Bondian type of spy, Jude Law, to fall in love with her. And that's her fantasy, that's her goal. In the comic hero's journey, you have these 7 steps that the comic heroes goes through. You start with the normal world, you then go to WTF, something impossible or improbable happens, then there's a reaction, connections, disconnections, new directions, and race to the finish. And we can go through all of those and see how it applies to a classic movie like Groundhog Day and a new movie like Spy or Tropic Thunder or This Is the End. So in the normal world, we see our main character who is broken or they're lacking something, and we get a glimpse of who they are. Michael Haig, in his work, likes to talk about essence and identity. My terminology is different, but it's the same idea. Mask to mensch. In the first act, the first part of the comic hero's journey, you see a character have a flash of who they really should be. There's a moment in Groundhog Day when Bill Murray first sees Andy McDowell, Rita, the producer, and all of a sudden you can see in his eyes that there's a change that's happened to him. But it's just a flash. It's just kind of a flash of who they might be. Their mask is taken off, and for a moment you can see the mensch that they're going to be. In Spy, Melissa McCarthy is guiding Jude Law through a series of fights in a mansion, and you can see how good she really is, how really capable she is in terms of what she knows and what she can do. But it's just a second, and then she goes back to being all fluttery when he says something nice to her, and she goes back to her sense of her not being enough. So you have this sense of who these people are. The other thing that happens in the normal world is you also get a sense of the theme. You hear the theme echo and re-echo in these moments. In Spy, Melissa McCarthy is sitting with her best friend Nancy at the CIA cafeteria, I guess. And she's talking about the lessons that Melissa McCarthy's talking about the lessons she got from her mother. And her mother used to put a little note in her lunchbox: "You will never achieve the dreams that you have for yourself." And in a sense, that's the theme of Spy, is having the courage to follow your own dreams. And at this point in the movie, Melissa McCarthy, who's playing this CIA analyst, Susan Cooper, doesn't feel like she can measure up to the glamorous spy Karen Walker or Jude Law's spy Bradley Fine. And in Groundhog Day, for instance, when Bill Murray first gets to Punxsutawney, he's walking down the street and he meets the obnoxious insurance salesman played by Stephen Tobolowsky. And one of the things that Stephen Tobolowsky says to him in talking about being an insurance salesman and selling him insurance is Stephen Tobolowsky says, "You know, a lot of my friends are into actuarials, but I say it's all big one crapshoot anywho." And that's a line that echoes what the theme is going to be, is that what is our future? What can we make our future? Can we predict our future, and can we change our future? Because ultimately that's what is going to be happening in Groundhog Day, is a man's going to have to live the same day over and over again and not be able to move on to his future. So after the normal world, you have the what the fuck moment, the WTF moment. And that is the essence of the comic premise. A comic premise is the idea that something impossible or improbable happens. Impossible in the sense of a man living the same day over and over again. That's impossible. Improbable that a somewhat out of shape, not too physical analyst could be put out into the field and do the daring do that a James Bond would. That's not impossible, but it is improbable. And so the comic premises revolve around the thought that this impossible or improbable moment happens, and it asks the question, well, what would happen then? And the best comedies then develop that premise through character. Paul Feig talks about how he wrote the script for Spy, focusing not on what funny things he could do, but what comic moments would come out of character, of simply putting Melissa McCarthy's character in these perilous situations and then seeing how she would cope, how she would grow, how she would become not only a better person, but a more fully realized person of who she is. So after you have the WTF moment, you have what we call the reaction. Now, in most comedies, when the character is faced with a life-changing, life-altering, impossible situation, most characters desperately try to claw back to the normal world. Now remember, in the normal world, your characters are misshapen. They're, your protagonists are not who they want to be or need to be, but they don't know it. They're unaware of it. They're like, they've turned themselves into a pretzel to try to convince themselves that they're having a happy life, that their life is okay. And when the comic premise occurs, that's all taken away from them. The rug is literally pulled out from under their feet. So in most reaction sections, there's a large part of the action that's denial. The characters desperately trying to go back to who they were, the way they were before this occurred. In Tropic Thunder, for instance, the WTF moment is Steve Coogan, the director, has taken Robert Downey Jr. and Ben Stiller and all these other actors out into the country, out into the jungle, because they're making a Vietnam era movie. And he wants them to experience the country, Nam, the country. And he accidentally steps on a landmine and blows himself up. And while some of the actors, especially Jay Baruchel, kind of thinks, well, this isn't part of the movie, this is not right, Ben Stiller, the protagonist of the movie, is convinced that it's simply part of the director's plan, and he keeps on trying to go along and keep filming this movie, this Vietnam era movie. So he is in denial that this has happened. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray spends the first day that he has relived in denial. He says, have we lived this? Is it still Groundhog's Day? It's only until the third day when he finally starts to then figure out what's happening and how he can deal with it. So the first part of reaction is usually denial, but the second part of reaction is starting to cope with the new situation, but without any character development or personality development or personality change. For instance, Bill Murray in Groundhog Day is kind of a jerk. So when he realizes that whatever he does will have no consequence for him, he still is a jerk. He figures out that if he can go talk to a girl and get some information from her, he can come back the next day. He'll remember all of the conversation, but she won't. And he can pick her up and have sex with her. And thereby, he has sex with all the women in Punxsutawney after a time. So you can see that he's dealing with the situation, but really without any character growth. For Melissa McCarthy, her reaction is both pain and sorrow because she loved Jude Law, but it's also anger and a sense of that she has to avenge his death. Jude Law gave her this terrible piece of jewelry that he put on a lanyard, a crazy cupcake that he gave to Melissa McCarthy, and of course it's a terrible idea to give that to a girl who is in love with you. But it becomes very important. Symbolic touchstones, tangible touchstones are very important in film because you can say a lot with a little. So at his funeral or the memorial service for him at the CIA, you can see Melissa McCarthy taking out the crazy cupcake ceramic, kind of touching it, and you could tell that she's trying to hold on to Bradley Fine, played by Jude Law. And then in another scene at the CIA, when they realize that everybody's cover's been blown and there's this nuclear bomb on the loose, but none of her regular spies, like Jason Statham's Ford, can go after it. Melissa McCarthy takes out the crazy cupcake, holds on to it, and quite out of character, jumps out and says, I can go. They don't know me. So that's her reaction. Her reaction is that even though she's scared, and even though she really doesn't have any faith in herself, she still is, because of her great love for Bradley Fine, for Jude Law, she's still going to do it. So reaction is the moment when characters are still trying to deal with this impossible or improbable set of circumstances that they're now trying to deal with. And what happens in this sequence is your characters are given simple tasks and missions to try to get to where they're going to go or do what they're going to do. For Melissa McCarthy in Spy, first she's sent to Paris, and all she has to do is go into an office and spy on this bad guy who's going to lead her to other bad guys who are going to lead her to the nuclear bomb. That's simple. She doesn't have to become a super spy to do that. But because they're on to her and because they've blown up the office building where she was supposed to be, one thing leads to another, and there's a series of discrete missions or tasks that she follows one after the other that lead her on the path to trying to recover the bomb, get the bad guys, and then avenge her love, Jude Law. And all the while she's doing this, without her realizing it, she's changing. Because what happens in a comedy, and you can argue in almost any movie, but especially in comedies, because you're starting with characters who are more than flawed. They're broken. There's something wrong with them. You can absolutely say there's something wrong with Ben Stiller in Tropic Thunder because he's an idiot. There's something wrong with Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. He's a jerk. There's something wrong with Susan Cooper, Melissa McCarthy in Spy, because she's got no confidence. She has no sense of who she is. And because of this impossible situation that they're now going to have to react to, characters are transformed. In a romantic comedy, it's love that transforms a character. Psychiatrists will tell you that, if you marry a jerk, 30 years later you have an older, fatter, balder jerk. But in romantic comedies, love is a magical power that is transformative. It transforms people. In Groundhog Day, it transforms Bill Murray from a jerk into a really good guy. He has to live through several lifetimes to get to be able to do that, but still. For Melissa McCarthy in Spy, what's transformative is, even though she's not aware of it, she's being able to come up with new powers, new skills. And in Reaction is the part of the movie in which new skills that had been hinted at in the normal world, new skills start to appear. In Melissa McCarthy's case, courage, boldness, everything that she wasn't back in the normal world, back in her basement office in the CIA, that vermin-ridden basement office. So you have the reaction, and then there's a part of the movie that we call Connections. And Connections is the part of the movie when your characters start to find unexpected allies and sometimes unexpected enemies. In Tropic Thunder, the two main actors, Robert Downey Jr., who's an Australian, playing an Australian who's playing a black sergeant in Vietnam, is always at odds with Ben Stiller's lead actor. And they barely talk to each other, they don't get along, but in the middle part of the movie, they start to actually talk to each other. And it's the first time that they're actually trying to make a connection. Connections is when things slow down in the movie, where you have heart-to-heart conversations, you tell the truth about each other. I guess the one caveat that I'd like to put out there is that all these elements are in all these comedy movies, but they're not necessarily in the same order. After Connections and New Directions, when characters get what we call the discovered goal, you have Disconnections, which is the dark night of the soul. And that's usually the part about 3/4 of the way or 4/5 of the way through, where everything seems lost and your hero is going to fail, and then somehow they find the power, the strength to try one more time, and they win. Now, normally that comes at about 3/4 of the way, 4/5 of the way through the movie. In Groundhog Day, however, that moment, that dark night of the soul, happens about midway through. It happens after the sequence in which Bill Murray, who, because he's found the skill to get whatever he wants by simply being able to anticipate what's going to happen, because he's living this day over and over and over again, he's able to rob a truck full of money. He's able to sleep with all the women in town. And then he gets the idea that he wants to have a relationship with Andie MacDowell, the producer Rita. And even though he tries over and over again, it always ends with this great slap montage. Slap, slap, slap. And now we're only about halfway through the movie, and that's the time in which he has lost all hope. He goes through this great series of suicide attempts. They're attempts because he does kill himself, but he wakes up the next day. In fact, Groundhog Day is a really interesting structure. It's basically structured after the long first act in which it sets everything up. It's structured like the 5 stages of grief of Kubler-Ross. There's denial, there's a very short section of anger, then there's a long negotiation period, then there is depression, and finally there's acceptance. But in Groundhog Day, there's 3 acts to acceptance. There's first getting Rita to believe in him. That's an entire act. Then there's the act of trying to save the old man, in which he's got to come to grips with the fact that he's not God. He's simply a man going through an impossible situation. And finally, there's the final act of acceptance, in which he simply accepts his fate. He's never going to live to see February 3rd. He's always going to be living in February 2nd. And he's okay with it. He's found out that the purpose of life for him is simply to do as much good as he can in the one day he has. So that's a way of just understanding that this framework, this structure, isn't a cookie cutter form that must be followed. That all these parts of the journey happen, they don't necessarily happen all in the same order or all at the same time. The thought that certain things have to happen on page 10 and certain things have to happen on page 26 is probably not a really good way to approach writing a screenplay. To go back to connections, in Spy, we have Melissa McCarthy meeting all sorts of people who are going to come to help her. She meets Aldo, who is this seemingly Italian spy who's working for the CIA, but who's always on the make and seemingly is always trying to stick his tongue down Melissa McCarthy's throat. Her friend Nancy, who's there helping her from the basement in Langley, shows up in Rome and is going to help her deal with all her missions as she's trying to retrieve the nuclear bomb. Even Raina, who is seemingly her nemesis, played brilliantly by Rose Byrne, turns out to, in the end, in fact, be another ally. So in Connections is the part of the movie in which your protagonist not only is moving outside their comfort zone, becoming a more actualized, more complete person, but they're able to reach out and create new relationships and on a new basis. One of the things that I do want to talk about in terms of the normal world, one of the things I didn't mention yet, is that in the normal world, your protagonist has flawed or absent relationships. Bill Murray doesn't have a girlfriend. He doesn't really respect women. Ben Stiller in Tropic Thunder, his only relationship is his agent, and even that is just kind of somebody to get him a TiVo. to be sent to this jungle where he's shooting this movie. And of course, Melissa McCarthy has no relationship. She pines for Jude Law, but we can see from an early scene in which Jude Law takes her out to dinner to thank her for being such a good helper, back in the CIA basement. That's where he kind of gives her this terrible, crazy cupcake piece of jewelry, because we can see that he doesn't really see her as an equal. So in the connections part of the comic hero's journey is where your character, because your character is transforming, your character is growing, and again, without them knowing it, we in the audience can see it, but they're still not aware of it. That's when these unexpected allies and also unexpected enemies can come out. That's the part of the movie where Melissa McCarthy realizes that Karen Walker, who she idolized, who was a star femme fatale spy at the CIA, was really a double agent. In connections, which may happen at different points in different movies, the important thing is that these connections are emotional connections. They're not just silly set pieces to continue the comedy. It's important, especially important for a comedy. Comedies need to, at some point, slow down, tell the truth, drop the facade. In Groundhog Day, that moment happens after Bill Murray has convinced Rita that something weird is happening to him. And he convinced her because he goes through everybody in the cafe and he tells Rita all their stories, because he's known them for so long. He's seen their stories for so long. And afterwards, they go back to, his hotel room, and they're just talking to each other on the bed, and he's saying, I wake up and it's the same day, and she says to him, well, maybe it's not a curse. I'd love to live 1,000 different lifetimes. He says, boy, you're a perky lady. And later that night, she's asleep, and he's reading French poetry to her because he's found out that she likes French poetry. And he starts to open his heart to her. And the funny story is that this part was written into the script because Bill Murray told Harold Ramis about the time that after he got married and his wife and he got to wherever they were going to honeymoon, it was really late, the wife went to sleep, and Bill Murray told Harold Ramis that what he did was, while she was sleeping, he was able to kind of open his heart to her and tell her everything that was on his mind and in his heart. And he was able to do that to her sleeping, that he wasn't able to tell her to her face. And Harold Ramis and Danny Rubin put it right into the script. And so it's this beautiful sequence in Groundhog Day where it's just the truth. He's just telling her what he feels. There's a similar moment in Spy, when, having gotten to the villain's lair, she and everybody's holding a gun on everybody else, she simply reveals to Jude Law, I love you. I've always loved you. Who wants to sit in a basement filled with vermin and rats? I would have quit that a long time ago, but I just wanted to be around you. And so it's the moment when things slow down, people start to really share what's in their hearts with each other. Michael Haig calls this the getting naked moment. In many romantic comedies, it happens about halfway through. In Spy, it happens about 3/4 of the way through, just before the race to the finish. And in Spy, she tells Jude Law exactly what she's thinking. In Tropic Thunder, it's a moment about halfway through when, for the first time, Ben Stiller and Robert Downey Jr. start talking to each other. and Ben Stiller's talking about how he did this serious film called Simple Jack, and he was kind of aced out of the Oscars. You know, the Oscars didn't give him any love. And Robert Downey Jr. says, well, I mean, you know why. Ben Stiller says, no, why? Robert Downey Jr. says, no, come on, you know why. Ben Stiller says, no, why? And that's the whole sequence when Robert Downey Jr. says, well, you went full tard. You can't go full tard. You can go half tard. You can't go full retard. And it's a very silly sequence, and you know, in a very non-PC way. It's funny, but it's also the first time in the movie that these two characters have actually talked to each other, spent time with each other, shared with each other. So Connections is that moment of the comedy where you can slow the comedy down. People have to just say what's on their minds, tell the truth. As Michael Haig says, get naked, not necessarily naked physically, but naked emotionally. And so after Connections, you have the part of the journey called New Directions. And New Directions is when your discovered goal happens. In a hero's journey, the hero goes off to right a wrong. And whether they right the wrong or not, that's the whole movie. Are they going to save the rebellion or not? And they might meet Yoda along the way, but their goal stays the same, really. But in comedy, because your characters start off as missing a part or broken, their initial goals are broken as well. They're short-sighted. They're not really the best for the character. And the discovered goal is what the characters discover along the way, what they really want. Bill Murray starts Groundhog Day thinking all he needs, all that would make his life perfect, would be to be a weatherman at a bigger, better station. But along the way, he realizes what he really wants is having a real relationship, and specifically a real relationship with Rita. In Tropic Thunder, the initial goal for all the actors is simply to get back to the base camp and get out of the jungle where you might step on a landmine and blow yourself up. But along the way, they realize that their fellow actor, Ben Stiller, has been captured by these drug lords. And so you have them have a different goal. Their goal now is simply not, well, do we just leave him here and go back? Or do we try to save him, even though we're just actors? We're not action heroes. We're not really soldiers. And that's when another important part of a comedy comes out, is decision points. You need real decision points in terms of your comic hero's journey. You want to avoid a situation where there's no question of what your character's going to do. It's completely obvious the way it should go. Why even bother wasting my time? One example of that in an otherwise well-received movie, but one I thought did not really give its protagonist a great decision point, is Midnight in Paris. Because in Midnight in Paris, Owen Wilson had to choose between this whining harpy of a girlfriend who he's engaged to, or one of the women that he's met in his time travels in Paris of earlier years. And to me, that's not a real decision point. Do you really think he's going to give up the romance of Paris and go back to California with this really annoying woman? A better decision point is in another romantic comedy, Sleepless in Seattle, in which Meg Ryan is engaged to Bill Pullman. And Bill Pullman is a great guy. But is he the guy? And that's a really great decision point, because you could support her going either way. You could see it from her point of view going either way. There's this maybe waiting for her at the top of the Empire State Building, but there's Bill Pullman right in front of you being such a nice guy. So you want real decision points. And in Spy, you see Melissa McCarthy having those real decision points. She has a new goal. Her goal is no longer to just have Jude Law be her boyfriend. Yes, this whole mission started out as a way of kind of avenging him. In fact, she often hurts her adversaries by saying that's for Bradley. But eventually her goal changes. Her goal isn't just to avenge Bradley Fine. Her goal is to do what she was meant to do, which is, I can do this. I can be this spy. I have these skills. I don't have to hide behind somebody else. I can do this, and I can save the world. I can save the world from having terrorists get this nuclear bomb. And so you see this moment in which she's been given the instructions, follow and report, do nothing else. And there's a bad guy who's running away from her. That's obviously the best lead to get to where the nuclear bomb is being hidden. And you see it in that moment. Do I just follow orders, or do I follow my own emerging, transforming sense of self and do what I think is right? And so at that moment, we see her discover a new goal for herself. Her new goal is, no matter what, she's going to see this through to the end. Now, after New Directions comes Disconnections. Disconnections is that moment in a movie when the lovers break up, when all seems lost. And for Melissa McCarthy in Spy, that comes at the moment in which it appears as though Jude Law has been a double agent working against the CIA all the time. And she's knocked out, and she's tied up, and she's thrown into a dungeon along with Aldo. And she says, I failed. It's over. And the disconnections is when you literally have disconnected from the people that you need to be with and be a part of. In Tropic Thunder, Ben Stiller literally says, listen, you guys can do what you want. I'm going to keep on shooting the movie. And he goes back into the jungle by himself, assuming that the dead Steve Coogan has cameras all over, hidden cameras all over, shooting this Vietnam era movie. And he's going to keep on doing it. So he's literally disconnected with all the other cast members of this movie. In Groundhog Day, that's where Bill Murray, after many, many tries, realizes, or thinks he realizes, he can't get Rita, and so there's no point to living. And he just gets more and more depressed. And that's also where it seems like Melissa McCarthy is going to give up. But after the moment of disconnection, and disconnection is also when the mask is put on for a second. It's the moment in Dodgeball in which Vince Vaughn, who seemed like he was becoming a nice guy, seems like he's going to be a creep, sell out his team and take the money and just fly back to his his gym or wherever he was from. It's the moment in which Melissa McCarthy begins to doubt herself again. It's the moment in which you think, what's the point of being this nice guy? I'll just go back to being who I was. So that for the moment, the mask, if you think of a character wearing a mask, taking the mask off, and there's the essence of the character, that's the moment when the mask is put back on. But then after that moment, what usually happens is a full realization. Everything becomes clear. Who they are, what they need becomes clear. Now, they might not win. Just because you're in a comedy doesn't mean that your character is going to succeed. In Love and Death, Woody Allen dies at the end of the movie. He comes back and comments on it as a ghost, but he's still dead. But that's the point of the movie in which everything has been revealed. All revelations have taken place, and now your protagonist can try to achieve what they need to achieve, what they want to achieve, and that's the part of the hero's journey that we call the race to the finish. And in that race to the finish, success or failure has to hang by a hair's breadth. It's always got to be a situation where it could go either way, believably go either way. In the race to the finish, your character literally has to take action. Now that seems like it would be self-evident, and yet I read a lot of screenplays in which you're a passive protagonist, passively lets something happen that passively allows them to succeed in the end. And if there's one thing you need to do at that moment in the hero's journey, is the character must take positive action. That's why we see Dustin Hoffman racing to the church. That's why we see Billy Crystal running through the streets of Manhattan to tell Meg Ryan he loves her. And it doesn't need to just be a literal race. I mean, That's Enough, with the very soft, kind of small, soft-spoken comedy with Julia Louis-Dreyfus and the late great James Gandolfini. He's broken up with her because he's found out that she was trying to keep the fact that his ex-wife is her new best friend and masseuse client, and he just couldn't deal with the duplicity, and he breaks up with her. And what Julia Louis-Dreyfus does is she simply drives by his house and stops outside his house. So it doesn't need to be racing down the street, but it does need for your character to take some positive action to make their dreams come true, to achieve their goal. And then the end of the comic hero's journey is you don't necessarily need to have a wedding or a celebration, but there has to be some hint of the future, that the future is going to be set on a better path. If you think about your protagonist starts off like a guy or a girl who slipped on a banana peel, and they've been stuck mid-fall, and they're in some odd contorted position. And then the comic premise kind of pushes them off balance. Well, they're off balance to begin with, but they don't know it. And so the first half of the movie is all about them trying to regain that contorted position that they had become used to. But then in the second half of the movie, they begin to find a new way to stand in the world. So that's what the end of the comic hero's journey is. You want to at least give a hint that things are going to be different, even if you don't spell it out, that there's going to be a better future for them now that they've transformed and they've come out on the other end of the journey. The important thing is that while your characters are transforming, they cannot become perfect, they can't become saints. So that the growth of the characters is inconsistent, sometimes accidental, and always with a sense of who they really are. So even though Melissa McCarthy becomes a really badass, kick-ass spy, she's still enough of who she was to begin with, that when she steals the Maserati to drive to the villain's lair and save Bradley Fine and save the world from the nuclear bomb, she still is enough in the moment to go, I love this new car smell. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray spends his last day helping everybody he can in town. The first thing he does is he knows that every morning this kid climbs up a tree and is going to fall from the tree backwards and crack his skull. So he's going to get there every morning, catch the kid, save the kid. But because he's still human, he's still a comic character. He hasn't turned into a saint or a perfect person. He catches the kid, and then he says to the kid, "You're going to thank me? You're going to thank me? You've never thanked me." He's still human enough to want to be thanked for putting himself out and catching kids who fall out of trees. So that's the important thing, is that your characters transform, but they don't transform to the point where they're no longer human. The whole point of your characters is that in a comedy is that to be human is to be flawed, and so they retain who they are as people, what their flaws are. There are a couple of important character types that you're going to have in your comedy. They don't all have to be in the same function in every screenplay, but every screenplay will have them. There's going to be a trickster character, somebody who breaks the rules, who bends the rules, who the Bugs Bunny of your film. In Groundhog Day, it's Bill Murray, but in fact, in Spy, it's actually Jason Statham, who shows up all the places. He always does what he's not supposed to do. He keeps on having these incredibly hard to believe tales of, I'm immune to 178 different kinds of poison because I took them all at once, at one time. You're going to have a fool in Spy. Jason Statham is also the fool. In Groundhog Day, it's Ned Ryerson, the insurance salesman. You're going to have the voice of innocence. Oftentimes in romantic comedy, you're the object of desire, the girl or the boy, if the protagonist is a woman, is your innocent, and you're going to have a voice of reason, somebody who gets to say what the truth is, how we see it. In many comedies, your protagonist, your comic is the voice of reason, because your comic is commenting not only on the external ramifications of what's happening in the plot, but also commenting on all the idiosyncrasies and the oddities that are happening in the plot. So there's a point in Spy in which Melissa McCarthy, because her initial cover is blown, has to pretend to be a bodyguarding Rose Byrne, and she becomes the kind of foul-mouthed comic that we've come to associate with Melissa McCarthy, and she looks and at Rose Byrne. Rose Byrne says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm trying to not get attacked by all the birds that are nesting in that nest of yours in the hair." I'm misquoting, of course. The voice of reason is that character who sees the truth and tells the truth, sometimes comically, sometimes just because, hey, that's what's happening here and no one else seems to see it. In both This Is the End and Tropic Thunder, Jay Baruchel is the voice of truth, is the voice of reason. Somebody simply saying, but I think the guy's dead, and I think we got to get back to base camp. So you're going to have these important character types. Your protagonist could be a trickster, your protagonist could be the innocent, but these are the kind of types that are going to be here and you're going to meet along the way in the comic hero's journey. So talking about the comic premise, a great comic premise is something where something impossible or improbable happens that could never happen. But since it does happen, it begs the question, well, what happens next? And the thing to remember about the comic premise is that it is one big whopping lie. And you get to lie only once in your scenario. Once. After that, everything has to develop organically based on character and theme. The premise is the engine. It shoots you into the narrative. For me, comic premise is a tool. It's not so much a pitch or a log line or an elevator. The elevator speech. The elevator speech. You're in the elevator. Steven Spielberg gets on, and you have between floors 1 and floor 7 to pitch him on your great idea. My best elevator speech is, "Would you press 3, please?" But for me, the comic premise is a tool because it's such a delicious idea to you that it shoots you into the narrative. What would happen then? What could happen? You create some impossibility, and then you're constantly creating, well, this would happen and that would happen. And there are a couple of kind of rules of thumb to follow. The first is you can't lie again. You cannot lie again. You can tell one big mother effing lie, but after that you have to play honest. And by playing honest, I mean you're just basing it based on character. And characters are brought on two ways. Characters are brought on through need and theme. What's need? You're at a cafe with a girl, and so you need a waiter or a waitress. So that characters are brought on through need. But characters are also brought on through theme. So what's the theme of Groundhog Day? You could say that the theme of Groundhog Day is what does it take to be a good person in the world? And so, so here's who you don't see in Groundhog Day. You don't see his mother because it has nothing to do with family. You don't see the President of the United States because it has nothing to do with politics. You don't see the character Stephanie because the character Stephanie in an earlier draft was an ex-girlfriend of Bill Murray's who put a curse on him that creates the time warp. And we're all really glad that they got rid of the character of Stephanie because it would have changed the theme of Groundhog Day from how can you be a good person in the world to how can you be a better boyfriend. So theme calls on characters. And so the only characters in Groundhog Day are the character of Bill Murray, our wily, crafty servant, trickster, the character of Rita, who's the object of desire, the love interest, the cameraman, and he's there because of need, because otherwise you're going to have a terrible shot on your remote if nobody's holding the camera. The only other character in the movie, really, after the first 3 minutes set in the Pittsburgh TV station, is the town. Because the theme is how can you be a better person, a good person in the world as encompassed by Punxsutawney. So you meet the piano teacher, you meet the mayor, you meet the insurance salesman, you meet the landlady. I mean, the only other characters in the movie are the town. So that characters are brought on through need and theme. So rather than thinking about the way to develop a premise is you create lots of stuff for characters to deal with, the better way, what Paul Feig talks about, is what would the characters do? This is what Chris Rock talked about in his last movie, Top 5. What would the character, given this weird, impossible situation, what would the character do given who these characters are? And that's the rule of thumb, is that you have to create all the events based on characters. And if you do, your movie will make sense in terms of developing the premise. And if you don't, you're going to have a movie like, what's a good example? Sometimes I use the animated example of Chicken Little, in which the first half of the movie is about an anthropomorphic chicken who humiliates himself and his father by claiming that the sky is going to fall, and the second half of the movie is an alien invasion. Those two halves of the movies fight against each other. They're two totally separate movies. So the whole idea of a comic premise is that you are developing this impossible situation through and by characters.